Arthur stood in the center of the marble-floored foyer, his feet perfectly still. The silence of the mansion pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight, thick and unyielding. He held a heavy gold watch in his palm, its rhythmic ticking the only sound in the vast, empty space. He stared at the dial, watching the second hand sweep past the markers, measuring time that had already slipped through his fingers. The mansion rose around him, a cavern of polished stone and high ceilings that swallowed his breath. He shifted his weight, and the sound of his boot against the marble echoed into the distant hallways, dying out before it reached the far walls. He gripped the watch tighter, the metal biting into his skin. There was no movement in the house, no voices from the kitchen, no footsteps on the stairs. He was the only thing moving in the entire structure, a solitary figure anchored in a monument of his own design. The memory surfaced, unbidden, pulling him back to the start. 40 years ago, the world was not marble and silence, but a cramped office with a single, scarred desk. He sat there until his fingers cramped and his eyes burned from the flicker of a single lamp. He pushed papers across the wood, his movements jagged and fast. He lived on cold coffee and the hum of the city outside his window, ignoring the sun as it rose and fell. Every contract was a battle, and every signature was a victory he claimed for himself. He worked until the ink ran dry and his back ached. Driven by the need to carve a space in the world, he ignored the fatigue that pulled at his eyelids, choosing instead to sharpen his focus on the next deal. He built his kingdom 1 hour at a time, trading his sleep for a foothold in the industry. The office was small, the air was stale, and the pressure was constant. He kept his head down, eyes fixed on the ledger, convinced that the weight of his effort would eventually translate into the life he imagined. He did not look at the clock. He only looked at the work, building the foundation of a life he would soon find he had no time to inhabit. The office grew, but his presence at home vanished. He missed his daughter's first steps because he was locked in a conference room, his hands trembling as he finalized a merger. He watched the clock on the wall, saw the hour pass, and simply turned back to the stack of contracts. Later that month, he skipped his wife's birthday dinner to secure a contract in a city 300 miles away. He sat in a sterile hotel room, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone while the city lights flickered outside his window. He told himself, "Just a little more gold, and then I will be there." He repeated it like a mantra every time he felt the sting of absence. He chose the late-night flight over the dinner table. He chose the board meeting over the sound of a child playing in the next room. He convinced himself that these were temporary trades, necessary sacrifices for a future that remained perpetually out of reach. He pushed the family photos to the edge of his desk to make room for more ledgers. He kept his eyes on the bottom line, ignoring the quiet house he left behind. The years blurred into a relentless cycle of boardrooms, late-night flights, and cold hotel rooms. He moved from one city to the next, his life measured in boarding passes and signed agreements. He stopped counting the days and started counting the assets. Finally, he built the house. It stood with 20 rooms, a sprawling structure of stone and glass that he viewed as the ultimate monument to his success. He walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing against the floors. He filled the vault with stacks of bonds, the paper crisp and cold under his touch. He hung paintings on the walls, selecting pieces for their market value rather than their meaning. He stood in the center of the grand foyer, arms crossed, looking at the high ceilings and the expanse of empty space. He believed he had arrived. He stood in the silence of his own creation, convinced that the sheer volume of his possessions was the kingdom he had promised himself. One Tuesday evening, the routine of his solitude shifted. Arthur walked into the dining room, his footsteps muffled by the thick rug beneath him. The mahogany table stretched out before him, polished to a mirror finish. It was set for 12. Exactly as he had instructed the staff weeks ago. 12 crystal glasses caught the light of the chandelier. 12 sets of silver rested perfectly aligned on the linen. He walked to the head of the table, his own plate, the only one occupied by a meal. He pulled his chair out, the wood scraping harshly against the floor, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. He sat, staring at the 11 empty chairs surrounding him. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the velvet back of the chair to his right. He expected to feel the warmth of a companion, a presence that would break the suffocating stillness. Instead, his hand met only cold, dust-free fabric. He pressed his palm against the seat, feeling the stiff, untouched cushion. There was no heat. There was no movement. He looked down the length of the table, the silver glinting in the dim light, and realized the table was a stage for a play that had no actors. He sat perfectly still, the silence pressing against him. Arthur pushed himself away from the table, the chair legs dragging across the floor with a sharp, jarring screech. He walked toward the window, his pace uneven. He needed to see something other than the polished wood and the empty silver. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, looking out into the sprawling garden. The moonlight illuminated a swing set in the distance, a structure he had purchased years ago. It was now a skeleton of iron, choked by thick, tangled vines and layers of rust. He stared at the chains, motionless in the night air. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. The sound of high-pitched laughter, once a constant melody in his life, now revealed as something he had actively ignored. He had kept his study door shut, the heavy oak blocking out the noise of a life he thought he could reclaim later. He looked at the overgrown grass beneath the swing, realizing the laughter had not just faded, he had traded it away. He had bartered those moments for the sterile, suffocating silence. Arthur turned away from the window, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked down the hall to the vault, the heavy steel door swinging open with a pressurized hiss. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against stacks of bonds and cold, hard metal. He pulled out a single, heavy bar of gold. It was dense, solid, and worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. He carried it back to the dining room, the weight of it pulling at his shoulder. He reached the table, the place where he had sat moments before, and set the bar down on the polished mahogany. It made a dull, final thud against the wood. He stepped back, looking at it. In the vast, echoing expanse of the room, the gold looked pathetic. It was small, dull, and utterly useless. It did not fill the space. It did not bring back the voices. It did not warm the air. He stared at the bar, watching the way the dim light failed to catch its surface. The object he had sacrificed everything to possess now sat before him, a lifeless anchor in a house that felt like a tomb. He sat back down, his hands resting on the table, and looked at the gold with a hollow, mounting despair. Arthur remained in the chair, his gaze fixed on the gold bar. The silence of the house was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to press against his very skin. He did not move, he did not blink. Then, the grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime. The first strike was deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. 1, 2, 3. Each toll marked the passing of another year he had spent chasing ghosts. He counted them, his pulse syncing with the rhythmic, mechanical beat. By the 10th strike, the sound filled the room, drowning out the hollow echo. At midnight, the final note hung in the air, slowly fading into the shadows. In that lingering stillness, the truth crystallized. He looked at the gold, then at the empty chairs surrounding him. He had spent his entire life accumulating things that could be bought, sold, or replaced. He had traded the irreplaceable currency of time and the warmth of human connection for cold, lifeless metal. The final chime of the clock died away, leaving the house in a silence so profound it felt like a physical barrier. Arthur did not move. He kept his hands flat on the mahogany table, his fingers inches from the gold bar. He reached out, his skin brushing the cold, unyielding surface of the metal. It was heavy, yet it provided no anchor. It was valuable, yet it possessed no warmth. He pulled his hand back, watching how the moonlight filtered through the high windows. The mansion felt vast, a sprawling labyrinth of rooms he had built to house a legacy that now had no one to inherit it. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked to the center of the dining room. He turned in a slow circle, looking at the empty chairs, the polished silver, and the dust-free surfaces that had demanded so much of his time. Every object was a reminder of a missed dinner, a skipped birthday, or a neglected conversation. He walked to the wall and rested his forehead against the cool plaster. The house did not respond. It was a machine of his own design. He returned to his seat, the gold bar still sitting where he had placed it. He did not try to hide it or move it. He simply sat in the dark, finally recognizing that the weight of his success was nothing more than a burden he had carried alone.